March 6th, 1944. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the bomber bases of southern England. At 4 in the morning, the thunder of B-17 engines shatters the frozen silence, pulling men from their bunks in the Nissan huts. The sound is different this time, not the usual rumble of 100 bombers. This is 800 heavy bombers starting their engines in near unison, and the ground itself seems to tremble. The crews know without being told that this mission will be unlike any they have flown before. They are going to Berlin. In the briefing rooms across the English countryside, curtains are pulled back to reveal a map of Europe stretching across the wall. A single red ribbon extends from the bases in southern England, cuts across the North Sea, crosses into German territory, and terminates at a large letter B, Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. 1,100 miles there and back. The men sit in stunned silence. Some light cigarettes with trembling hands. Others simply stare. Berlin has been the target of nighttime RAF raids for months, but this will be the first major American daylight assault on Hitler's capital. More importantly, for the first time in history, single-engine fighters will escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. Those fighters are the P-51 Mustangs, and on this cold March morning, they represent something the Germans believed impossible. For years, the Luftwaffe had operated under a simple tactical principle. Wait. Wait until the American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings reach their fuel limits and turn back toward England. Then attack the bombers at will. The B-17s and B-24s, no matter how heavily armed, could not survive sustained assault from German fighters. The Americans had learned this lesson in blood over Schweinfurt, where 60 bombers were shot down in a single mission. Over Regensburg and Munster, where the sky filled with parachutes and burning aircraft fell like terrible rain. The 8th Air Force had suspended deep penetration raids into Germany because the losses were simply unsustainable. But the P-51 Mustang changed everything. This aircraft began its life in an unusual way, born from British desperation rather than American innovation. In 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging and British aircraft factories struggling to meet demand, the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation. They wanted more Curtiss P-40 fighters. The president of North American, Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counteroffer. "Give us 6 months," he said, "and we will deliver something better, something entirely new." What emerged was a beautiful aircraft with clean lines and a laminar flow wing that sliced through air with minimal drag. But the early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, were disappointing at high altitude. They performed well at low levels, but bomber escort missions required fighting at 20,000 feet and above, where the thin air choked the Allison's performance. The Mustang was fast and maneuverable, but it could not reach the altitudes where the bombers flew and the German fighters prowled. Then someone had an idea that seemed almost too simple. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary, was a superb high-altitude performer. What if that engine were mated to the Mustang's exceptional airframe? The marriage was consummated in late 1942, and the result was extraordinary. The P-51 B and C variants, powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, combined range, speed, altitude performance, and maneuverability in ways no other fighter could match. With drop tanks slung beneath the wings, the Mustang could fly all the way to Berlin and still have fuel to fight. The Germans could not believe this was possible. Their intelligence officers studied the wreckage of downed American fighters, measured fuel tank capacities, calculated consumption rates, and concluded that no single-engine fighter could reach Berlin from England. It violated every principle of aerial warfare they understood. Fighter escorts were always short-ranged. That was simply the nature of the technology. The Americans might reach the Ruhr, perhaps as far as Frankfurt on a good day, but Berlin, impossible. On March 4, 1944, the P-51s proved them wrong. The 354th Fighter Group, flying Mustangs barely 3 months after receiving them, escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the first time single-engine fighters had made the 1,100-mile journey. The mission was a revelation and a shock. American fighters appeared over the Reich capital, mixing with German interceptors in swirling dogfights above the city streets. Hermann Göring, who had once promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, watched from the ground as vapor trails wrote the story of his failure across the winter sky. 2 days later, on March 6th, the Americans returned in even greater force. 830 heavy bombers assembled over England. Over 800 fighters would escort them, including squadrons of the new Mustangs. The armada that took to the skies that morning was the largest the 8th Air Force had yet committed to a single mission. It was also one of the most dangerous. The target was not just any city, it was Berlin, and the Germans would defend it with everything they had. The bomber crews climbed into their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, weighted down with layers of clothing against the brutal cold of high altitude. Fleece-lined jackets, leather gloves, oxygen masks, parachutes. Each man carried 40 pounds of gear before he even reached his station. The B-17s and B-24s were not pressurized, and at 25,000 feet, the temperature could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite was as dangerous as flak. Men had lost fingers and toes to the cold, and gunners sometimes found their machine guns frozen solid. The flight across the North Sea took over an hour. Below, the gray water stretched to the horizon. If an engine failed here, if damage forced a crew to ditch, survival time in those waters measured in minutes. The bombers flew in tight formations, each group stacked at different altitudes, creating a defensive box of interlocking fire. But they all knew that once the fighters attacked, formation discipline often dissolved into chaos. Over the Zuider Zee, the first signs of battle appeared. Smoke trails rose from the ground, where earlier formations had been engaged. The wreckage of aircraft, both American and German, littered the landscape below. The P-47 Thunderbolts that had escorted the bombers this far waggled their wings in farewell and turned for home. Their fuel was running low. In the old days, this was when the German fighters would appear, waiting like wolves for the shepherds to leave. But this time, the shepherds did not leave. As the P-47s departed, the P-51 Mustangs arrived, sliding into position around the bomber formations. Major Tom Hayes of the 357 Fighter Group led his squadron toward the rendezvous point near Brunswick. His group had been flying Mustangs for only 3 weeks, and combat experience was limited, but the aircraft itself was proving to be everything the pilots had hoped for. Light, responsive, faster than anything the Germans had, and with fuel to burn. Hayes spotted them first. German fighters assembling in formation to his right. Not a few scattered interceptors, but a massive strike force. 7 twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 fighters led the formation, followed by 41 Messerschmitt 410S, and behind them, 72 single-engine Messerschmitt 109S, 120 German fighters converging on the American bombers in a coordinated assault. It was exactly the kind of attack that had devastated unescorted bomber formations in the past. But the Mustangs were there. Hayes keyed his radio. "I'm taking the top, guy." He rolled into the German formation, and 33 P-51s exploded from the haze behind him. The carefully organized German attack shattered instantly. Fighters scattered in all directions. The Messerschmitts broke formation, diving and climbing and turning in desperate attempts to shake the American fighters from their tails. Some German pilots, seeing the Mustangs, simply reversed course and fled. They had been told that American fighters could not reach this deep into Germany. The intelligence briefings had been explicit. Yet here they were, not exhausted and low on fuel, but fresh and aggressive and deadly. A Mustang pilot chased a Messerschmitt 109 down through the clouds. The German pilot threw his aircraft into violent maneuvers, skidding and banking, trying every trick to escape. The American stayed with him, nose to tail, waiting for a clear shot. At 8,000 feet, the German made a mistake. He pulled up too hard coming out of a dive, bleeding energy. The Mustang closed to 200 yards and the pilot pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns converged on the Messerschmitt's cockpit. The glass canopy shattered. The aircraft nosed over and plunged straight into the ground, exploding in a ball of orange flame. This scene repeated itself across the sky over Germany that day. Individual combats, small groups of fighters tangling in tight spirals, long chases that ended with a burst of gunfire and an aircraft trailing smoke. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the American formation. Fighter units scrambled from bases across northern Germany. Some pilots flew as many as 5 sorties that day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before launching again. The scale of the battle was unprecedented. Nearly 2,000 aircraft filled the sky over Berlin. Bombers and fighters from both sides mixing in a three-dimensional battlefield that stretched from ground level to 30,000 feet. The bombers pressed on through heavy flak over the city. Anti-aircraft shells burst in black clouds, each explosion sending shrapnel in all directions. The concussions rocked the heavy aircraft, and sometimes a burst would strike home. A B-17 took a direct hit to its number 3 engine. The engine tore away from the wing, trailing flame and debris. The pilot fought to keep the aircraft level as 2 more engines lost power. The bomber fell out of formation, losing altitude, becoming a target for any German fighter that spotted it. But the Mustang pilots had learned a new tactic. Instead of staying in close formation with the bombers, they ranged ahead and to the sides, hunting for German fighters before they could organize their attacks. When they spotted enemy aircraft assembling, they dove on them, breaking up the formations before the attack could develop. This was what General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, had ordered. Take the fight to the enemy, seek them out, destroy them wherever they can be found. The Mustang had the range and performance to do exactly that. The cost was high on both sides. By the end of the day, the Americans had lost 69 heavy bombers and 11 fighters. 250 airmen died over Germany that day, and more were taken prisoner after parachuting from crippled aircraft. But the Luftwaffe lost 81 fighters, 81 aircraft, and 81 pilots. Many of them experienced veterans who could not be replaced. Germany's aircraft factories were working at maximum capacity, but pilot training had been cut to dangerously low levels. Fuel shortages meant that new pilots reached combat units with as little as 30 hours of flying time. An experienced American pilot with 200 hours in a P-51 was more than a match for a German novice in a Messerschmitt 109. The bombing results on March 6th were poor. Heavy cloud cover over Berlin obscured the targets, and most bombs fell scattered across the city rather than hitting the assigned industrial areas. But that was not the point. The strategic objective had been achieved. American bombers had struck Berlin in daylight, escorted all the way by single-engine fighters, and returned to England. The myth of Berlin's invulnerability was shattered. The psychological impact on German morale was profound. If the Americans could reach Berlin in daylight, if their fighters could dominate the sky over the capital itself, then no target in Germany was safe. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, stood on a balcony in Berlin and watched the battle unfold above him. The vapor trails of hundreds of aircraft crisscrossed the sky. The distant sound of engines and gunfire echoed across the city. Flak bursts dotted the blue. When he saw the distinctive silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs circling over Berlin, engaging his fighters on equal terms this far from England, he turned to an aide and spoke words that would become famous. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." He was right. The arrival of the P-51 as a long-range escort fighter marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. From March 1944 onward, the pressure on the Luftwaffe became relentless. American bombers, protected by swarms of Mustangs, ranged across Germany at will. The targets were aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail yards. Anywhere the German war machine depended on production or transportation became vulnerable to attack. The Luftwaffe was forced into an impossible position. If they did not defend these targets, Germany's industrial capacity would collapse. If they did defend, they faced battles of attrition they could not win. The Americans had more of everything. More aircraft, more fuel, more pilots, more replacement crews. When a P-51 was shot down, another arrived from the factory within days. When a pilot was lost, another emerged from the training pipeline in America, where fuel was abundant and instruction thorough. The Luftwaffe had no such luxury. Every loss was a loss they could barely afford. The skilled pilots who had survived Poland and France in the Battle of Britain were being ground down in daily battles over the Reich. The replacement pilots who took their places lasted days or weeks before they too were killed or captured. In April 1944, the 357th Fighter Group, one of the Mustang units that had fought over Berlin in March, claimed 26 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. It was the highest score ever recorded by a single American squadron in one day. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force had converted to Mustangs. The P-51 dominated the sky over Europe. It destroyed nearly 5,000 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. It provided the protective umbrella that allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue without prohibitive losses. It gave the Allies air superiority, which was a prerequisite for the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The significance of that air superiority cannot be overstated. When Allied troops stormed the beaches at Normandy, the Luftwaffe was barely present. German fighters had been withdrawn to defend the Reich against the bomber offensive, and those that remained in France lacked the fuel and pilots to mount effective opposition. The soldiers waiting ashore at Omaha Beach did not have to contend with German aircraft, strafing the landing craft or bombing the supply ships. The invasion succeeded in part because the P-51 Mustang had won the battle for control of the sky months earlier, over targets like Berlin. The human stories behind these vast strategic movements were often small and strange. In the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich, as American and British forces advanced from the west and Soviet armies closed from the east, countless moments of confusion and capture played out across Germany. One such moment involved the crew of a Heinkel He-111 bomber, an aircraft that by 1945 was thoroughly obsolete, but still pressed into service for transport and evacuation duties. The Heinkel's crew completed what they thought was a routine flight. They were exhausted, disoriented by the deteriorating situation on the ground, navigating with outdated maps and incomplete intelligence. When they spotted an airfield below and saw what appeared to be familiar markings, they made the decision to land. The wheels touched down, the engines spooled down to silence. The crew climbed out of the aircraft, stretching cramped muscles, relieved to be on the ground. Then they noticed the soldiers approaching. American soldiers. The uniforms were wrong, the weapons were wrong, everything was wrong. The realization hit them all at once. They had landed behind enemy lines. In the confusion and panic, some of the Germans reached for cigarettes, offering them to the Americans in a desperate gesture of goodwill. Others fumbled with papers, trying to produce documents as if bureaucracy might save them. One American soldier, seeing the frantic scene about to escalate, shouted a single command that cut through the chaos. "Weapons down!" The Germans complied. They had no other choice. The war was over for them, ended not in a dramatic final battle, but in a simple navigational error and a hasty surrender on a captured airfield. They became prisoners, joining the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who were flooding into American custody as the Reich collapsed. What followed was a revelation that spoke to a deeper truth about the war. An American news reporter, touring the prisoner of war facilities, interviewed one of the captured German pilots about conditions. The reporter expected complaints, perhaps bitterness about captivity. Instead, the pilot offered an observation that was startling in its simplicity and its implications. He ate better as an American prisoner than he had as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. The pilot explained that the rations provided by the Americans were more substantial, more varied, and more nutritious than what he had received during his service in the German armed forces. He noted with a mixture of irony and disbelief that even the food given to American military dogs was of higher quality than the rations he had eaten during the war. This was not an exaggeration for effect. It was a simple statement of fact that revealed the vast disparity between American and German logistics. The German military diet, particularly in the later years of the war, had been reduced to basics. Black bread made from coarse rye flour, potatoes in vast quantities, often boiled without seasoning, thin soup that was more water than substance. Meat was rare and often consisted of organ meats or processed sausage of dubious quality. Coffee was ersatz, made from roasted acorns or grain because real coffee was unavailable. Fresh vegetables and fruit were luxuries. The famous goulash kanoni, the field kitchen that traveled with German units, produced meals that kept men alive but provided little else. American rations, by contrast, were abundant. Even the basic K ration, which American soldiers often complained about, contained far more calories and variety than German field rations. The C ration provided canned meat, crackers, candy, cigarettes, and coffee. Hot meals served in rear areas included fresh meat, potatoes with butter, vegetables, bread, dessert, and real coffee with cream and sugar. American soldiers grumbled about the food, as soldiers always do, but they never went hungry. The logistical pipeline that kept them fed stretched back to farms in Iowa and Texas, processed through factories in the Midwest, shipped across the Atlantic in convoys, distributed through depots in England, and delivered to the front lines with remarkable efficiency. This difference in logistics extended to everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, replacement equipment. The American military machine operated on a scale that Germany simply could not match. When an American fighter pilot shot down a German aircraft, he returned to base to find his P-51 refueled, rearmed, and ready for another mission within hours. When a German pilot landed after combat, he might find fuel shortages that grounded him for days, ammunition that had not arrived, or mechanics without the parts needed to repair minor damage. The captured German pilot's observation about food was a small detail, almost trivial in the context of a global war that killed millions. But it illuminated a larger truth that decided the outcome of the conflict. Germany was fighting a war it could not win because it did not have the resources, the industrial capacity, or the logistical infrastructure to sustain prolonged conflict against the combined might of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The P-51 Mustang was a manifestation of that American industrial and technological power. It was designed quickly, produced in massive quantities, constantly improved through successive variants, and deployed with devastating effectiveness. By the summer of 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had shifted decisively. The Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded. American, British, and Canadian forces broke out of the beachhead and began driving across France. Soviet armies advanced relentlessly from the east, liberating territory and pushing toward Berlin. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing from British aircraft at night and American bombers by day. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Fuel shortages grounded many units. Replacement aircraft sat in factories because there were not enough trained pilots to fly them. The few experienced pilots who remained were exhausted, flying mission after mission with inadequate support and declining morale. The RAF, which had been forced to conduct only nighttime bombing missions because daylight raids were too costly, resumed daylight operations in late 1944. This was possible because the P-51 had broken the back of the German fighter force. The sky over Germany, once defended by thousands of fighters and millions of anti-aircraft shells, was now dominated by Allied aircraft. The strategic bombing campaign, which had nearly failed in 1943 due to unsustainable losses, achieved its objectives in 1944 and 1945 because the Mustang provided the protection the bombers needed. The numbers tell the story. The 8th Air Force's P-51 group shot down nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft by the war's end. This was almost half of all American claims in the European theater and more than any other Allied fighter achieved in air-to-air combat. An additional 4,000 German aircraft were destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with a formidable force of skilled pilots and modern aircraft, ended it with 9 operational Heinkel bombers and a handful of jet fighters that could not reverse the inevitable outcome. The cost to achieve this victory was significant. About 2,500 P-51s were lost in combat. Behind each lost aircraft was a pilot, and behind each pilot was a family who received a telegram and a flag. The air war over Europe was brutal and unforgiving. Men died in fires at high altitude, in aircraft that broke apart under stress, in crashes on return to base, and in captivity after parachuting into hostile territory. The bomber crews suffered even worse. The casualty rate among 8th Air Force bomber crews was staggering. Some groups lost more aircraft and men than they began with, as replacements arrived and were lost in turn. But the strategic objective was achieved. Germany's ability to wage war was systematically destroyed from the air. The oil refineries that produced fuel for tanks and aircraft were reduced to rubble. The ball-bearing factories that produced components for aircraft and vehicles were bombed repeatedly. The rail yards that moved men and supplies were torn apart. By early 1945, the German military was immobilized not just by the armies pressing in from all sides, but by the collapse of its logistical infrastructure. The P-51 Mustang made this possible. It was not the only factor in Allied victory, but it was a critical one. It solved the problem that had plagued the strategic bombing campaign from the beginning. How do you protect bombers on deep penetration raids into enemy territory? The answer was a fighter with the range of a bomber and the performance to dominate enemy interceptors. The Mustang was that fighter. It arrived at precisely the right moment, in sufficient numbers, flown by pilots trained well enough to use it effectively. The legacy of the P-51 extended beyond World War II. The aircraft saw service in the Korean War, where it flew ground attack missions until jet fighters became available. Many Mustangs were sold to Allied nations after the war and served with foreign air forces into the 1980s. Racing enthusiasts restored and modified P-51s for air racing, where they continue to compete today. The Mustang has become an icon of aviation history, instantly recognizable by its distinctive shape and widely regarded as the finest piston-engine fighter aircraft ever produced. But on March 6, 1944, the Mustang was simply a tool of war, doing the job it was designed to do. It escorted bombers to Berlin and brought most of them home. It fought German fighters over the capital of the Third Reich and won. It demonstrated that American industry could produce weapons that matched or exceeded anything the enemy fielded. It changed the strategic calculus of the air war in ways that reverberated through every subsequent campaign. Hermann Göring's words, spoken as he watched Mustangs circle over Berlin, captured the significance of that moment. The jig was up. The war was not yet over. 11 more months of brutal fighting lay ahead. Tens of thousands more would die. Cities would be leveled, and armies would clash in final desperate battles. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had achieved air superiority. The P-51 Mustang, arriving over Berlin when the Germans believed such a thing impossible, had broken the myth of German invincibility. The story of the Mustang is ultimately a story about the power of innovation, industrial capacity, and strategic vision. It took American engineers and British engine designers. It required factories running 3 shifts a day, producing aircraft by the thousands. It demanded pilots willing to fly into the most dangerous airspace in the world and fight outnumbered against a determined enemy. It needed planners who understood that control of the air was the foundation upon which all other military operations rested. All of these elements came together in a single aircraft that changed the course of the war. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war alone, but it made victory possible. It protected the bombers that crippled German industry. It destroyed the fighters that would have made the Normandy invasion far more costly. It demonstrated American technological prowess and industrial might in a way that no speech or propaganda could match. When the Germans looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin, they understood what the captured pilot in American custody had learned. The United States had resources and capabilities that Germany could not match. The war was lost not in a single battle, but in the cumulative weight of American production, logistics, and innovation. The Heinkel crew that landed by mistake on an American airfield learned this lesson in the most personal way. They had fought for years in an air force that grew weaker each month, flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate fuel, facing an enemy that grew stronger with every passing day. They had watched as their comrades were shot down in numbers that could not be replaced. They had experienced the slow collapse of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, the steady erosion of morale and capability that comes when everything is in short supply except orders to continue fighting. And when they became prisoners, they discovered that even in captivity, the Americans had more of everything. More food, better conditions, more resources to spare. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The captured pilot who told the reporter that he ate better as a prisoner than as a soldier was not making a political statement. He was simply acknowledging reality. The side with more industrial capacity, more agricultural output, and more efficient logistics could afford to feed its prisoners well. The side struggling to feed its own soldiers could not. This disparity in logistics extended to every aspect of the war effort. American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. German factories produced about 120,000. The United States built nearly 90,000 tanks. Germany built about 50,000. The numbers for trucks, artillery pieces, rifles, and every other category of military equipment showed similar ratios. The United States was fighting a war of production as much as a war of combat, and it won that war decisively. The P-51 Mustang embodied this victory. It was built in numbers that overwhelmed German production. It was constantly improved through D&K model variants that addressed shortcomings and enhanced performance. It was supported by a logistical system that ensured parts, fuel, and ammunition were always available. And it was flown by pilots who received thorough training because the United States had the fuel and the instructors to provide it. When all of these advantages came together over Berlin in March 1944, the result was inevitable. The Germans could not compete. They could fight bravely, and they did. They could innovate tactically, developing formation, flying techniques, and new weapons in desperate attempts to counter Allied air superiority. But courage and tactical innovation could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources. The Luftwaffe was being ground down by attrition, losing aircraft and pilots faster than they could be replaced, while the Allies grew stronger each month. The legacy of March 6, 1944, is that it marked the moment when this disparity became undeniable. The Germans had believed that Berlin was beyond the reach of American single-engine fighters. They had built their defensive strategy on that assumption. When P-51 Mustangs appeared over the capital, escorting bombers and shooting down German fighters, that assumption collapsed. Everything that followed, the intensified bombing campaign, the invasion of Normandy, the steady advance toward Berlin from east and west, became possible because air superiority had been achieved. The war would continue for another year. Battles would be fought and won. Cities would fall. But the fundamental outcome was determined in the skies over Berlin on that cold March day in 1944. The Mustang had done what the Germans said could not be done. It had reached Berlin. It had fought and won, and in doing so, it had broken the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich. The German pilot who praised his American captors for feeding him better than his own army had, was acknowledging a truth that extended far beyond meals. He was acknowledging defeat, not in a single battle, but in the larger contest of industrial production and logistical capability that determined the war's outcome. The P-51 Mustang remains a symbol of that victory. It represents American innovation and industrial power. It stands for the idea that wars are won not just by soldiers in combat, but by factories producing the tools of war, by farms feeding those factories' workers, by training programs preparing pilots, by supply lines delivering fuel and ammunition, and by strategic planners who understand that success requires all of these elements working together. The Mustang was the product of that system, and when it arrived over Berlin in March 1944, it announced to the world that the Allied victory was no longer in doubt. The jig was up. The war would end with Germany's defeat, and the long-range fighter that made this possible would be remembered as one of the most significant aircraft in aviation history.